Hello class, Dr. Bauer's office hours, and I hope you prepared for this video in the same way that Socrates says that you should prepare for death. Namely, by doing some philosophy. Here's some study guide questions for the Phaedo. First, which puzzle about suicide arises in the Phaedo's opening passages? Second, how does Socrates argue that philosophy is practice for death? Third, what is the ancient Greek conception of the soul? Fourth, how does Socrates argue that philosophers should look forward to death? Fifth, what is the opposites argument for the soul's immortality? Sixth, what is the recollection argument for the soul's immortality? Seventh, what is the affinity argument for the soul's immortality? And eighth, so, how does Socrates solve this puzzle about suicide, then? Alright, as always, you'll want to follow along with a pad of paper and a pencil and maybe a laptop, or at any rate something to record the answers as they come up in this lecture. There's a lot to cover here, and the Phaedo is one of the more influential philosophical dialogues in all of Western philosophy. It was frequently known as On the Soul, and it's Plato's main work on the afterlife. There are other works in which Plato explores the post-mortal fate of the soul, such as Republic Book 10. However, this is the most famous one because it provides many arguments, and a lot of those arguments are influential in contemporary discussions of whether the mind is an immaterial substance. So here's the setting. We begin, and this is a frequent narrative device in Plato's dialogues, we begin with a couple of characters recalling a discussion that they had earlier with Socrates. In this case, it's the characters of Socrates and Phaedo, and they're talking about that one day, Socrates' last day, when he was finally executed for the crimes he was found guilty of by the Athenian authorities. Socrates asks, hey, were you there when Socrates finally died? And Phaedo says, yes, I was. So was this person, and that person, and this person, and that person. He lists quite a few people. The most important characters are going to be Simmias, Cebus, Phaedo himself, and also of important note is that Plato is mentioned as being absent. That's right. So in the dialogue which represents Socrates' final days, in that very dialogue, a character says, Plato wasn't here for this. And most Plato scholars and classicists agree that this is a case in which Plato is saying to the reader, or to the listener if it's being performed, that this is not a historical account or a factual account of Socrates' final discussion. This is an occasion in which Socrates is being used as a character to talk about the soul's final fate, or to talk about fate. And in this dialogue, Socrates and his friends, his interlocutors, they talk about what's going to happen to him after he dies. So then we get a kind of flashback into Socrates' cell, where he's chained up and he's awaiting execution, and his friends come to visit him. And at that point, there's a couple of things that happen. One thing that happens is his wife, who is there, Socrates' wife, is taken away crying as she's saying, oh my goodness, this is the last time you'll see your friends, and this is so sad. And Socrates says, take her away, which is kind of a almost comically cruel behavior. It certainly might express something about Athenian patriarchy, the fact that, Socrates is about to die, and he says to his wife, get lost, and then he welcomes his philosophy buddies to come on and hash some ideas before he finally ends his life. In any case, the other thing that happens that's interesting is Socrates says, as he's rubbing his hands when the shackles are removed, how interesting it is that pain and pleasure are so intermingled, that in a way you can't tell whether something is pleasure or just the absence of pain, or whether something is really pain or just the absence of pleasure. And his example, of course, is that it feels good to get his shackles off. It feels like pleasure, But really, what was going on is that the shackles were causing him pain, and now he's just experiencing pain's cessation. Pain's cessation feels like pleasure. What is pleasure, however, other than what it feels? So that's an interesting topic that's going to arise whenever Plato discusses the body and how the body doesn't perceive things clearly. It comes up in Book 9 of the Republic, too. So as Socrates and his friends discuss the fact that he is going to die, the fact that he's going to be executed by being ordered to drink hemlock tea, he expresses some optimism that he believes he's going to a better place. He believes he's going to a good place. And this gives rise to a certain puzzle. It comes up most explicitly at line 61d, when Cebus asks, "How do you mean, Socrates, that it is wrong to do oneself violence, and yet the philosopher should be willing to follow someone who is dying?" What's going on is this, that Socrates believes that he's going to a better place. The puzzle is, if a better place lies just on the other side of death, why not get there as quickly as possible? Why not just kill yourself to get to the better afterlife more quickly? It's a real puzzle when you think about it. I mean, if the afterlife is better than life, and once you're in the afterlife, you'll be there forever, so it's always better, why not just go to the afterlife as quickly as possible? That's the puzzle. And note something interesting, that one of the first suggested solutions to the puzzle is that we're possessions of the gods, and the gods wouldn't like it if one of their possessions killed itself. Socrates asks, wouldn't you be angry if one of your possessions tried to kill itself when you were not ready for it to die? And Cebus agrees. But is that a convincing reason? Right? If a better experience for you lies on the other side of death, why does it matter if it disappoints a god for you to go there? Perhaps the god will punish you. That's how the Christian view sees it, is that you can't get to a better afterlife by suicide because God punishes suicide. But this does not quite solve the problem either. For you could ask that pernicious question, why? After all, if there's a better afterlife, why wouldn't God or the gods want you to get there as quickly as possible? If they had your best interest in mind, why wouldn't they want to expedite that? And why would they oppose anyone who chose to expedite that? Saying it's wrong to kill yourself just raises the question. Either it is the best thing to be a living possession of the gods, or it's not the best thing and being in the afterlife is better. If it's the best thing to be the living possession of the gods, well then, now we have lost the ability to look forward to death. In other words, Socrates can no longer hope that he's going to a better place if the reason for not committing suicide is that the place he's at, alive, is best. So we can't prohibit suicide on the grounds that the gods' possessions are living people and it's best to be one of them. That won't work. On the other hand, if it's not best to be one of the living possessions of the gods, there goes the possibility of saying that it's bad to kill yourself. So which is it? Is it that don't kill yourself because the gods like you alive, in which case you have nothing to look forward to in death? Or is it that you should kill yourself because it's not nearly as good to be alive, in which case we have that problem? The puzzle is this. How can someone look forward to death, genuinely believe that there is something better waiting for them after death, and yet not have a reason to commit suicide? How is that even possible? Now, the Judeo-Christian tradition solves this puzzle, or attempts to solve this puzzle, in a very specific way, a very straightforward way. The straightforward way is this. There is something to look forward to after death, but the rule is you can't kill yourself to get there. Why not? God says so. Why does God say so? Well, that's the main objection faced by this proposal. If the reason not to kill yourself is simply that the gods say, that's not allowed, that raises the question, well, why not? Why isn't it allowed? There's this amazing afterlife that's set up, and to get there, you just need to die. Why would you say that it's not allowed to just take the most straightforward way there? As we fill out Plato's own answer through the mouth of Socrates and his interlocutors, we're going to see that his solution is quite different, and it avoids this particular difficulty, although having difficulties of its own. As a rough first sketch of what Socrates' solution to this puzzle will be, he begins by saying that he thinks philosophy, that art of thinking about deep things just for the fun of it, philosophy is practice for death. What does that mean exactly? Well, here's the argument as Socrates gives it, albeit formalized. First, they agree. Death is the separation of the soul from the body. Secondly, philosophers, as philosophers, that is, to the extent they are philosophers, shun the pleasures of the body. Third, to shun the pleasures of the body is to separate one's soul from one's body as much as possible while remaining alive. So, philosophers, as philosophers, insofar as they are philosophers, separate their souls from their body as much as possible while remaining alive. If death is the separation of the soul from the body, then to separate one's soul from one's body as much as possible while remaining alive is to practice dying. So, to separate one's soul from one's body as much as possible while remaining alive is to practice dying. So, philosophers, as philosophers, insofar as they are philosophers, practice dying. That's the argument, and there's a few things to mention. There's a lot going on here. First of all, there's an assumption about what kind of a thing the soul is in order for this to make sense. In 20th, 21st century and modern times, people will ask, do you believe in a soul? Is there such thing as a soul? Do human beings have a soul, right? That's a question that is a common one to talk about. The Greeks wouldn't have talked about it that way, or the ancient Greeks would not have talked about it that way. For the ancient Greeks, a soul, or psyche, is whatever it is that makes you grow and be alive. That's what it is. A soul is just whatever makes you grow and be alive. It's the thing that explains your being alive. So, if something is alive, it by definition has a soul. Most definitely does. The question is not whether it has a soul, but whether its soul can be separated from the body and still exist. Whether the soul is immaterial, as it were. In a modern context, when we ask whether people have a soul, it's sort of assumed that souls are immaterial things, and if people have them, then they've got an immaterial part of themselves or something. But for the ancient Greeks, and as we'll see in the Phaedo, there's more of a debate like this. Is the human soul a material thing or not? If it is a material thing, then there is no afterlife, and if it's not a material thing, then there might be one. So, that's how the discussion will proceed. A soul is, for the Greeks, it's whatever makes you grow and be alive. That's how we're going to think about it. The Latin term, anima, perhaps connotes this better, since anima is related to animate and animated, which means to move around and be alive. Or animal, which is something that moves around and is alive. But that's one assumption. So if you assume that the soul is whatever makes you grow and be alive, then death would indeed be the removal of that thing. Plato uses the phrase separation, and that's probably because separation is neutral between those who think the existence of the individual ends upon death, and those who think the individual continues to exist upon death, albeit in a way where their soul is just separated from the body. But that explains why there's this first assumption that death is the separation of the soul from the body. The soul is just whatever makes you be alive, and death is taking that away. To say that philosophers, as philosophers, shun the pleasures of the body, is to say that part of the craft, part of the techne, or part of the art of doing philosophy, involves focusing your attention on intellectual things. To do philosophy is to sharply and exclusively attend to intellectual matters to the exclusions of bodily ones, right? The idea is that when philosophers are doing their craft, they're not hunting on horseback, and they're not throwing discuses, and they're not having a drinking contest. When philosophers are actually pursuing their craft and pursuing it correctly and well, they're avoiding those bodily indulgences and engagements, and they're going, right? And they're trying to focus their attention on just intellectual matters, separate their soul, separate themselves from the body and its sensations. So that's the idea behind philosophers, as philosophers, separate the soul from the body. And there's this idea that, well, if death is taking your life force away from the body, and if philosophers, when they do their thing, they're trying to get away from the body as much as possible and just focus on intellectual stuff, Socrates draws a likeness between those and says these are kind of similar. It's like, when you're doing philosophy, you're making a little separation from your body, and when you die, you have a big separation from your body. So that's how philosophy is practiced for death. That's cartoony, but that's sort of the idea. In addition to this idea that philosophy is practice for death, and what that means we'll fill in as we go, there's also this idea that philosophers should really look forward to dying. Why? Well, here's the argument. First, philosophers take pleasure in knowledge. And knowledge, real knowledge, is always knowledge of the forms. If the soul can exist without the body, then death will bring knowledge of the forms. The soul can exist without the body, so death will bring knowledge of the forms. So death will bring knowledge. Philosophers should look forward to whatever will bring them pleasure. Death will bring philosophers pleasure, that follows. So, philosophers should look forward to death. So this is the first mention in the dialogue of Platonic forms, although they're not mentioned in that way. Socrates asks, don't you believe in the just itself, and that kind of reality, and the beautiful and the good? Which is a standard way in which Plato references the forms. He'll say the beautiful, the good, the just itself, and all that kind of reality. That's usually the way that they come up. And in this case, to that list, we add health, strength, and size. This list should clue us in that we're thinking of something like science. That might not be obvious at first from thinking of good and beautiful, but when it comes to real worldly knowledge, it's of principles and laws. Real knowledge is going to be stuff like the volume of a cylinder is pi times radius squared times height. That's always true, no matter what. You could bet the world on it. You can always predict that's going to be the case. Or that fish breathe water. Necessary. Always the case. That's a law, right? It's not something that's about that particular fish or this particular cylinder. It's not like, as a matter of coincidence, this one cylinder, its volume is pi times radius squared times height. Or this one fish, as a matter of happenstance, it breathes water. No. Right? To really know about the world, you don't just know about particular cylinders or particular bits of volume or particular fish or particular bits of health. No, real knowledge, law-like scientific knowledge, is about cylindricality itself. What all cylinders must be like because they have cylindricality. Real scientific knowledge is not of individual fish, but of the property of being a fish, and how fishhood incorporates gills and the capacity to breathe oxygen. That's the basic idea. And these things, right, cylindricality itself, fishhood itself, we might get inklings of such things through sensory interaction, but to really study and know them, that requires going beyond our senses, as Plato puts it, and thinking about them, focusing. And the more you can focus on those, the better your knowledge. That's the idea. That's the idea behind this, that philosophers, what they really enjoy is the kind of knowledge that comes from thinking really hard and focusing on stuff. Right? Not the kind of sensations and surveys we associate with sensory perception. That's all bodily stuff, and philosophers don't enjoy that, and that's not philosophy. No. What philosophers enjoy are studying things with their mind. And you know what distracts from that? Bodily sensations. You start to study cylinders and spheres and cool geometric things like that, but then, you're hungry. And then no sooner you get back to it than, you have to go to the bathroom. And then no sooner you get back, and right, every single time you try to really engage in some fun knowledge, then your body goes off with some alarm or some alert or some need that needs to be addressed. At least that's the way that Socrates and his interlocutors are discussing matters here. So there's this idea that death, the separation of the soul from the body, that's what will bring knowledge. Freedom from all of those bodily distractions. That's when you can really concentrate on all that cool stuff there is to know about cylinders and fishhood and other things. Health. Of course, this argument contains a very important presupposition, and we're going to be occupied with this presupposition for most of the rest of the dialogue. That presupposition is that the soul can exist without the body, right? By saying that death will bring knowledge of the forms, we're assuming that when the soul is separated from the body, it'll still be around. It'll still be around to encounter the forms and know them better. It'll still be around to be free of bodily distractions. And Simmias and Cebes immediately raise the worry of, what if that's not true? This whole argument that philosophers should look forward to death, and with it the argument that philosophy is really a kind of practice for dying, both of those arguments, they just go out the window if the soul doesn't even exist apart from the body. If the soul is something which, like a breath, just dissipates into the air and no longer exists once it's exhaled, well then, that would be bad news for Socrates' optimism. So that's the next topic that they immediately discuss. What follows is a trio of arguments for the immortality of the soul. They're rather famous. One of them is incredibly famous and has influenced a lot of research into the hypothesis of psychological nativism, the idea that we have innate knowledge, and related discussions. Others, still influential. These three arguments are called the opposites argument, the recollection argument, and the affinity argument. Let's just go in the order in which they're presented and start with the opposites argument. The opposites argument doesn't get a lot of kind treatment. Among the three arguments that are presented here for the soul's immortality, it is the one that looks the least plausible to the casual reader. And a lot of times you'll find the opposites argument being phrased this way. First, opposites come from opposites. Second, death and life are opposites. Third, if death and life are opposites, then life comes from death, so that must mean there's an afterlife, right? And that's not the way the argument goes. That doesn't actually grant enough credit to what Plato is trying to observe. The key assumption in this argument, which, by the way, goes from 70e to 72b, is this. Whenever a thing X comes to be F, X was formerly non-F. That's the key assumption right there, is that when something comes to be F, if it comes to be F, it was formerly not F. If any argument is wanted, it's this. Try to imagine something that was never not F. In other words, try to imagine something that was always F. In what sense did that thing come to be F? It didn't. If the thing was always F, then there's no sense in which it came to be F. It was always F. Having always been F, and coming to be F, those are incompatible. Because they're incompatible, it's kind of a conceptual truth that whenever a thing X comes to be F, it was formerly non-F. If a thing comes to be red, right? If it comes to be red, then it wasn't always red. It was formerly non-red. It came to be red, but before it wasn't, right? Or if a thing comes to be large, beforehand it was not large. Otherwise, it didn't come to be large. It was just always that way. And so on. Now, with that principle, let's observe that, now, things come to be alive. That's undeniably true. Stuff comes to life. Things are born. New plants sprout. So stuff comes to be alive. And to be alive is to have a soul. Remember our definition of what it is to have a soul. A soul is just whatever makes you grow and be alive. So things come to be alive. And to be alive is just to have a soul. So things come to have souls. Right? That's the idea, is things come to be ensouled. Right? They come to have souls. They didn't have souls before, but then they have them. Next key assumption, it's impossible to acquire a soul unless souls exist apart from the body. Right? How could you acquire something if it didn't exist there? That's the reasoning. Right? I can't acquire some keys unless there are already keys out there to acquire. I cannot acquire a puppy dog unless there's already a puppy dog out there to acquire. I cannot acquire a pizza unless there's a pizza out there already to be acquired. And in general, I cannot acquire a thing unless there is that thing already waiting for me to acquire it. So, if things come to have souls, if things acquire souls, there must be souls for those things to acquire. There must already be souls waiting, so to speak, for the new animals to be born and for the new plants to sprout and that sort of idea. I mean, if there weren't souls already waiting, then stuff would die and then no new stuff would come to life, reasons Socrates. And Socrates draws this funny analogy with Endymion, the creature with 1,000 eyes, and every eye just fell asleep. And as the eyes fell asleep one by one, no new ones were opening, and pretty soon they were all closed, all asleep. The idea is that if there weren't souls that were already disembodied waiting to jump into a new living body, then, well, the life forms that are in existence that do have souls, they would die, their souls would disappear, and then there wouldn't be anything waiting to fuel the next living bodies. That's the idea, right? So, souls can exist apart from the body, right? That's the assumption. Whenever a thing X comes to be F, it was formerly non-F. Things come to be alive. To be alive is the same thing as to have a soul. So, things come to have souls. It's impossible to acquire a soul unless souls can exist apart from the body. So, souls can exist apart from the body. That's the argument, and that's the reasoning behind the argument. And I hope, as I have explained, you can see that the problem lies in that assumption about how it's impossible to acquire a soul unless they can exist apart from the body. The problem is that assumption. It's this cartoony assumption that you can't get a thing unless the thing is already there to get. An opponent of the opposites argument might say this: why can't a thing acquire a soul by growing it? Right? As a set of tissue develops, it grows arms and legs, and an acorn, as it develops into a sapling, grows a trunk and it grows leaves. Why can't it be that in the course of a thing's physical development, it comes to be alive not by grabbing a soul that was already in existence, and or by the soul that was already in existence jumping into its body, as it were, but why can't it just come to have one by generating it? So there's the opposites argument, there's sort of an explanation for it, and there's what's wrong with it. Next, the recollection argument. This is the most famous and arguably most plausible of the three arguments, although I personally, as a philosopher, only know a couple of people who are regarded as eccentric, who regard this argument as completely sound. This is the argument. The argument depends on this idea that we have knowledge, and that this knowledge cannot be acquired just through experience with sensorially detectable individuals in the physical world. Since we have knowledge of something that can't come through the senses, we must have known about it outside of our bodies before we were embodied, before birth, and that shows that our souls existed before birth. So, the recollection argument, it's not an argument that shows the soul will exist after death. It's specifically an argument that shows that the soul existed before birth. But hey, if it existed before birth, that shows it can exist apart from the body, and that's what the company are interested in. Here are the details of the argument. First, when a person S perceives a thing X, and is thereby made to think of another thing Y, S is remembering Y from a previous encounter with Y. This is just an idea of what it is to be reminded of something, right? Socrates' own example is you see someone's coat and you're reminded of them, right? Whenever you encounter one thing, and by encountering that, you think of another thing, that's you remembering that thing. That's just kind of what it is to remember, according to Socrates. Going onward. Second, equality itself exists and is distinct from any set of equal things. What's the idea behind this? Well, equality itself, the property of being equal, this is a Platonic form, and although we won't get into a full defense of the ontology of forms right here, we could say that for Plato, the property of being equal is not the same thing as any set of equal items. After all, you could destroy any set of equal items, and that wouldn't destroy the mathematical notion of equality. It wouldn't destroy the property of being equal. Things could still be equal, even if there were no actual pairs of equal things. There still could be such a thing as equality. Equality itself would still exist. And reasoning like that is why Plato would say that this premise is true, that equality itself is a real thing. We appeal to it all the time in science. And it's not the same thing as any particular set of equal sticks or stones or planets or whatever. Moving onward. When we perceive a set of equal things, we are thereby made to think of equality itself. When you encounter a couple of things that are equal, let's say equal in their size, here are a couple of books, equal size books, when you encounter these, you think, those are equal. They have the property of being equal. They have the feature of equality. You might not phrase this in your mind literally using those words, but you have a judgment about them, and the judgment appeals to this feature, the feature of their being equal. This is something that you think of when you encounter the set of equal things. But notice, this is you thinking of equality itself when you encounter a set of equal things, and equal things are not the same as equality itself. So, when you encounter a set of equal things, you are remembering equality itself from a previous encounter with equality itself. Or at least that's what follows in the arguments in the next step, see? So we remember equality itself from a previous encounter with equality itself. Next, as long as we have had sensory experience, we have never encountered equality itself, right? You've never encountered equality itself with your eyes. You don't see it. The only thing that you can see are sets of equal things. Those are visible, but equality, the property of being equal, is not a thing that you can just see, like it's walking around. Oh, there's the property, right? That's not a visible thing. It's a conceptual thing. We have had sensory experience since birth, so we remember equality itself from encountering it before birth. However, if we remember equality itself from encountering it before birth, then our souls existed before birth. So, our souls existed before birth. That's the argument. And the argument, again, basically says this, that as we move about in the world, we make certain sorts of judgments that these things are equal and those things are unequal. And we have this concept of perfect equality. But we could only employ this concept of perfect equality if we've encountered perfect equality. And as long as we've been alive, we've never encountered perfect equality. So, we must have encountered it before we were alive. That's the recollection argument stripped down. I mentioned this is taken to be a fairly good argument and fairly influential, although almost nobody takes this particular conclusion from it. More frequently, people will take this conclusion, that if we employ the notion of perfect equality in our judgments, and if that notion cannot be acquired from sensory experience, because we never see or encounter perfect equality, that must mean we are born with the knowledge. That's what it must mean. And so this type of argument, this recollection argument, nowadays is often used to defend what's called nativism or psychological nativism. The idea that there's certain knowledge that we're born with, or certain knowledge that's innate. Socrates and Glaucon actually consider this. They perhaps dismiss it a little too quickly. Socrates reasons that if people were born with the knowledge of equality itself, that must be the moment at which they learn it. They learn it upon birth. However, we've already established that people forget it upon birth too. And Socrates has this principle that he just kind of throws out of nowhere that says you can't learn and forget something at the same time. So that's his metaphysical argument for why it's not innate knowledge that explains how we make judgments with the concept of equality. Instead, it's that your soul encountered equality itself before it was embodied. The idea is that before your soul was embodied, it dwelled among the forms, among the divine entities, like the gods and the daimons and spirits and stuff. And that at some point, for some reason, it ceased to be among them and came to be embodied. And then, once embodied, it now only remembers little bits of the forms that encountered before, and very frequently, when it embodied encounters sets of equal things, it reminds it of equality itself. That's the idea, that when you make this judgment about perfect equality, you are recollecting an encounter, vaguely recollecting an encounter with equality itself. What about the idea that we get our knowledge of equality itself from experience? Why can't we just say that we get our knowledge through abstraction? Right? Abstraction, remember, is this process of selectively attending to just one of many features that a thing may have, or of approximating while doing that, right? We might not have perfect equality anywhere in the world, and so we might not actually perceive perfect equality with our minds, but our minds are possessed with the capacity to diminish or exaggerate in our imagination. And why can't we take two things that are almost equal from experience and perform that operation and get our concept of perfect equality that way, right? Why isn't that the flaw in the recollection argument? Well, it might be, but Socrates would probably reason this way, that in order for you to arrive at a concept of perfect equality by taking a set of imperfect examples and then approximating with them, you would already have to know which examples to take and how to approximate. You would have to already know what you were looking for, in other words. You would have to already be aware of what equality is so that you take the right things and then approximate them in the right way to arrive at it. For Plato, getting a general concept through abstraction is like a teach yourself to read book. In order to actually do it, you need to already possess the ability that you're supposed to be acquiring. Can't be done. Right? How on earth are you supposed to assemble all the groups of two, all the pairs, in order to abstract from them and say, that's what two is, if you don't even know how to assemble the pairs in the first place? Okay? Abstraction requires having the right set to abstract from, and having the right set to abstract from, arguably, already acquires acquaintance with the thing that is the abstraction. Wow, things are getting a little bit complicated here. Let's go on to the next argument. The affinity argument, while perhaps not the best argument on its own, nonetheless includes a kind of assumption which runs all the way through Plato's and Aristotle's and the Neoplatonists' philosophy, which is this, that first, the soul enjoys and interacts with things that have an intellectual nature, an abstract nature. Intelligible things, we could call them. Abstract things, we could call them. That what the soul enjoys doing and what its characteristic functions seem to involve is a kind of interaction with abstract reality. Okay? But the soul could not interact with such a reality unless there were a shared nature, right? In order for the soul to engage with intellectual things, the soul must itself have some intellectual nature, right? In the same way that I couldn't dig in my solid garden unless I also had a solid tool, nor could I mess about in an ideal garden unless I had an ideal tool. Very cartoony image, but this is what Plato's thinking, right? So first, that what the soul enjoys and what the soul involves is interaction with ideal things. Secondly, that if the soul enjoys and involves itself with ideal things, it must share a nature with those ideal things. Third, if the soul shares a nature with those ideal things, then the soul is separable from the body. So, the soul is separable from the body. That's the idea, or at least it's phrased to be more probable than that. That's an odd thing about this part of the Phaedo, is that you notice Plato using probabilistic language when evaluating the argument, saying, well, then it would be more likely that the soul is immortal. And you think, more likely? Don't you want certainty? But never mind that. The idea is that because the soul interacts with, engages with, and does a lot of things with immaterial substances, equality itself, right, the forms, the soul should be like those substances. It should have a nature with them, and that nature is to be capable of existing all on its own in the abstract. So, just by way of its job description, in a way, by way of being the thing that interacts with ideal reality, the soul would have to also be of a sort where bodily death would not destroy it. That's the last argument. It turns out to be quite influential in some Aristotelian thinking, as we may see. So once all three of these arguments are presented, we get a sort of summary and a kind of just-so story about how mortality is supposed to work. The soul, before it is embodied, it dwells among the forms, and it enjoys this beautiful reality with perfect things, perfect mathematical standards. And then it drinks of the river Lethe, forgets these things, except for just a little bit, and comes to be embodied. And once it's embodied, it walks around in the physical world and acquires desires. And it acquires tastes for things and starts to enjoy things. As the soul comes to enjoy things, this sets it on a certain kind of trajectory. For when the body dies, and the soul is separated from the body, it then goes and tries to find the thing that it learned to enjoy. So, if a soul comes to be embodied, and while it's embodied it learns to enjoy food a lot, then as soon as that soul pops out of the body upon death, it's going to try to find where the food is at. And it'll probably become incarnated in something that enjoys food. So someone who really lived for the eating, once they died, they might find themselves being reincarnated as a cow or a goat or something that just eats a whole lot. Right? Because their soul is going to look for that kind of thing. On the other hand, if someone really lived for, say, socializing and popularity, and if that was what they were the most interested in, well then, as soon as they died, their soul would pop out and now look for, hey, where's all the socializing at? Where's that at? Right? And it would go towards, well, a social set of creatures, right? It would be reincarnated as a wolf amongst a pack of wolves, or a bee in a bunch of beehives, or, you know, something where the animal species involves a lot of talking to each other and socializing, right? But what if the person loved philosophy the most, right? What if that's what they enjoyed doing? Well, that's what something special, thinks Socrates. For if a soul studies philosophy and studies it well while it's alive, then, upon death, the soul has a chance to find its way back to that awesome, perfect reality that it originally came from and hang out there for a while. Maybe forever, maybe until just the next time it takes a drink of that fateful river, but that's the best fate. Right? So we see what the solution to this puzzle is. For Socrates, philosophy is literally the cartography of the neither world, right? That if you study it only a little bit while you're alive, well, then you just have a little bit of a chance of finding where those cool philosophical entities, the forms, are at, and so you just have a little bit of a chance of getting to the right afterlife once you're dead. Otherwise, you're going to have your soul stuck in the body of a plant or an animal or some kind of thing for a while until the next cycle, right? But if you study philosophy more while you're alive, your soul will have a greater chance of getting the best afterlife. And if you study philosophy even more, you'll have an even better chance of finding that afterlife. And the idea is that the more philosophical knowledge you have, right, the more you really understand what justice is, and what beauty is, and what goodness is, the more you grasp that, the firmer and better your knowledge of the way to find them once your soul is separated. If you really know what beauty is, then you can spot it and go and find it once you're disembodied, and you can dwell with it again. Right? So that's why you can't kill yourself, is that you need as much study time as possible, as much cartography of the neither world as possible, so that when you're finally separated from your body, you can really have the best chance of making it there. Right? That's how Socrates squares the circle in this puzzle about suicide, right? That there is something to look forward to, but you can't kill yourself in order to get there more quickly. And the reason why you can't kill yourself to get there more quickly is not because big heavenly authority just says you can't. It's because of this metaphysics of practice and study, and how the philosopher practices in a way where the more time they do it while alive, the better the chances are for getting that thing they're looking forward to. Right? It's a unique way of looking at this puzzle about a pleasant afterlife, vindicating the pleasantness of the afterlife while shunning the possibility of suicide in a way that doesn't feel sort of ad hoc and just purely stipulative and like, oh no, you can't do it, God doesn't want you to. Right? And while discussing this, you also get some neat, colorful imagery about post-mortal ideas that we talk about today, too. You know, they talk about ghosts. Did you see that? At this part in the Phaedo, they're talking about graveyards where lost souls who can't find their next reincarnation just sort of hang out. And sometimes if you go to a graveyard, you can see those lost souls, and they're all spooky-wooky, right? And this is kind of like a fun lull in the Phaedo, I think, talking about... I don't know if it's intended to be fun. I think it's intended to be more solemn. But this is a part in the Phaedo where we get a bit of poetry and description, and a bit of ancient Greek religion, and sort of Pythagoreanism about reincarnation and stuff. And so this is a nice time to stop, and we'll pick up more on the Phaedo next time. We'll do the sort of second half of the Phaedo. We'll look at objections to the idea that the soul can be separated from the body, and how Socrates tries to answer those objections. So, thanks for watching. See you next time.